Prison reform groups have backed government plans to scrap jail sentences of less than 6 months, but the Probation Officers Union says the approach won't work without more resources. President Trump has angrily dismissed a report that the FBI investigated whether he was secretly working for Russia. 2 firefighters and a tourist have been killed in a gas explosion in central Paris. Dozens of people were injured. And in sport, Liverpool have extended their lead at the top of the Premier League. The trade union that represents probation officers has welcomed government proposals to abolish most prison sentences of 6 months or less in England and Wales, but said they won't work unless they're given more resources. The Ministry of Justice says it's considering the change because short jail terms are less effective at cutting reoffending than community penalties. Our correspondent, Catherine Stancheshan, reports.
The Prisons Minister, Rory Stewart, made it clear when he took over the job that reducing the number of short-term jail sentences handed out by the courts was a priority. The prison population in England and Wales has doubled since the 1990s and now stands at more than 80,000. 2/3 of inmates serving sentences of less than a year reoffend within 12 months. Mr Stewart said the use of what he called good community sentences would prevent those with chaotic lifestyles entering a cycle of criminality, easing the burden on prisons in the process. It's a view shared by some campaign groups who've welcomed the idea. Francis Crook is the chief executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform.
We do not want overcrowded prisons. We do not want fetid prisons that actually make crime worse, because the majority of people who come out of prison commit more crimes. That's a failure for everybody. It's a failure for victims, it's a failure for the taxpayer, and it's a failure for those individual people too. This is a sensible policy and the Howard League welcomes it.
Under these proposals, sentences of less than 6 months would no longer be given other than in the case of violent crime or sexual offences. A similar scheme is already operating in Scotland, where reoffending rates have dropped to their lowest point in 19 years. But there are concerns it amounts to being soft on crime. Others feel there must be more resources available for other forms of rehabilitation in order to make this approach work. Ian Lawrence is General Secretary of NAPO, a trade union for the probation service.
The service was split into 2 4 years ago. It has been a disaster, and we need investment now to repair that damage, so we're in a position to accommodate the extra thousands of people who it is intended will be out into our streets. And we welcome that, and we want to work with the ministers on that, but we must have urgent resources invested into the service now.
The Ministry of Justice said short sentences were too often ineffective, but at the moment this was simply an option under consideration.
The White House has dismissed a report that the FBI began an investigation into whether President Trump was working secretly for Russia. The New York Times suggested the Bureau acted after Mr Trump sacked its former director, James Comey. Here's our Washington correspondent, David Willis.
According to the New York Times, FBI officials became suspicious of Donald Trump's ties to Russia during his 2016 campaign for the presidency. His refusal to criticize Moscow and his call for the Russians to hack into the emails of his opponent Hillary Clinton piqued their curiosity, but it wasn't until May of 2017, when the president sacked the FBI director James Comey, that the organization actively began to investigate whether he was working for Russia, be it knowingly or unwittingly, and whether his actions posed a threat to national security. But days after it began, a special counsel, Robert Mueller, was appointed to look into allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election, and the investigation was rolled into his inquiry. Mr Mueller has yet to release his findings, but the New York Times report says a vigorous debate has since taken shape amongst former law enforcement officials over whether the FBI overreacted. In response to the paper's report, Mr Trump expressed incredulity that the FBI acted, as he put it, without reason or proof in investigating him. He also claimed that he had been far tougher on Russia than his presidential predecessors, and once again branded the Mueller inquiry a witch hunt.
2 separate campaign rallies have taken place, putting forward different visions of how Britain can break the political stalemate over Brexit. Leading Remain supporters were among the speakers in Sheffield, calling for a second referendum, while left-wing activists held a march in London demanding a general election. Here's our political correspondent, Tom Barton.
When MPs vote on Tuesday, the likelihood of Theresa May's Brexit deal being approved is slim. And so, today, two different protests with two different answers to what should happen next. In Sheffield, the People's Vote campaign held a rally to call for another referendum. Speakers from Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats shared a platform. Lib Dem leader Vince Cable told the crowd the campaign was close to victory because there had been a cross-party approach.
This is a horribly divided country. Brexit has split us in different ways. And when we've finished, when we've won, we've got to bind the country together. And that's where this process, the working together, has got to continue. It's so important.
In London, the left-wing group The People's Assembly held a separate protest.
General election!
The focus was on how Tuesday's vote could be used to force a general election. Among the Labour figures who attended was the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell.
This isn't just about Brexit, this is about austerity as well. That's why so many people were marching today. But also we're seeing a government literally disintegrate in front of our eyes. Legislation it can't get through, even its own Finance Act it had to amend as a result of having to capitulate to the opposition at time and time again. So we're seeing a government in office but not in power, and it's time therefore to have a general election.
The Transport Secretary Chris Grayling warned today that a Brexit that failed to deliver on promises to end free movement and leave the single market would open the door to extremist, populist political forces. The chances of a general election or another referendum may become clearer after MPs vote on Tuesday night.
3 people, 2 firefighters and a Spanish woman have died in a huge explosion in central Paris caused by a gas leak. Dozens of people were injured, 10 of them seriously. The blast occurred near the Paris Opera, a popular tourist area. Tom Singleton reports.
The explosion happened this morning as firefighters were looking for a gas leak. This recording was made shortly afterwards by an onlooker as flames and smoke spewed from the building. The force of the blast overturned cars, blew out shop fronts and covered the streets with broken glass. People in nearby apartments described their windows shattering and doors being wrenched from their hinges. Dozens of tourists, some with suitcases in hand, were evacuated. This man, Pedro, was working in a hotel opposite the building where the blast happened.
When I walked through the door, I heard a huge explosion. The force of the blast was very strong, showering me with pieces of glass and bits of ceiling. There was a lot of blood on my neck and on my head too. I couldn't breathe because of the black smoke, so I covered my face, and luckily I know my way around the hotel, so eventually I located the exit.
Police officers blocked off several streets in the area, allowing helicopters to land and ferry the injured to hospital. 200 firefighters were called to the scene. The Interior Minister, Christophe Castanet, said the number of dead would have been higher if it hadn't been for their bravery. He said they had taken very large risks to save lives, including those of their colleagues, some of whom were buried under the rubble for 2.5 hours.
The President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, says his country is facing a major crisis of rape and sexual assault, and he urged men to unite against it. He made his impassioned plea when he launched an election manifesto for the governing ANC in Durban. Our correspondent, Andrew Harding, reports from Johannesburg.
President Cyril Ramaphosa urged every man in Durban's packed stadium to stand, and they did. He said women were being raped and killed on a continuous basis in South Africa. It was a national crisis, he said, and we must pledge to end it. It was a passionate and unexpected moment. Many assume this year's national elections will be dominated by the governing ANC's poor record on corruption and the economy, and on the enduring legacy of racial apartheid. But 40,000 rapes are reported here every year, almost certainly a fraction of the real total. And President Ramaphosa said it was time South Africa took steps to ensure that it was no longer defined by the crisis of gender-based violence.
The official runner-up from the presidential election in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Martin Fayulu, has begun a legal challenge to the result amid concerns that it was rigged. Another opposition leader, Felix Tshisekedi, was declared the winner, but Mr Fayulu has accused him of striking a power-sharing deal with the outgoing president, Joseph Kabila. Our Africa regional editor, Will Ross, reports.
The judges at the Constitutional Court have a week to consider Martin Fayulu's petition. They could order a recount or even cancel the whole election, but the most likely scenario is that the petition will be rejected and Felix Tshisekedi will be sworn in. The extraordinary thing about this whole election is just how opaque it is. The Electoral Commission, it seems, is not even compelled by law to publish the results from each polling station, making it impossible for any comparisons to be made with observers' tallies. The outgoing president, Joseph Kabila, will retain huge influence and could return as president in the future. The suspicion is he's done a deal with Mr. Tshisekedi, who may not even have secured the most votes. Since its independence in 1960, Congo has never had a peaceful transfer of power through the ballot box. Now that political parties loyal to Mr. Kabila have also won the majority of seats in parliament, the change millions of Congolese had been hoping for could well remain just a dream.
Leeds United Football Club have apologised to Derby County for sending a member of staff to spy on their players' training this week. Leeds beat Derby 2-0 last night to strengthen their position as the Championship leaders. The Football Association is investigating. Here's our sports correspondent, Patrick Geary.
Leeds United say they will speak to their manager Marcelo Bielsa to remind him of the club's honesty and integrity after he admitted sending a staff member to spy on Derby County training. Bielsa said he'd done it without seeking permission from Leeds. The man was removed from outside the training ground on Thursday by Derbyshire Police, ahead of Leeds' Championship match against Derby, which took place last night. Top of the table, Leeds won the match 2-0. Derby's manager Frank Lampard refused to blame the spying for the defeat, but said it had to be dealt with.
Sport now, and with details of another win for Liverpool and the rest of the day's action, here's Nicola McCarthy.
Liverpool have extended their lead at the top of the Premier League to 7 points after a 1-0 win away at Brighton. Mo Salah earned the winning penalty and then converted the spot kick himself. Liverpool captain Jordan Henderson says it was a hard-earned win.
Brighton are a good side and make it very difficult, especially at home. Defensively well organised, and it was difficult at times to try to break them down, but it was important for us just to keep our patience. We knew that the chances would come in the end and we'd get one, but it was about protecting on the counter-attack and just being patient, and overall we did the job.
Elsewhere in the Premier League, Burnley came from behind to beat Fulham 2-1. Southampton won at Leicester by the same scoreline, and there were also wins for West Ham and Watford. In the late kick-off, Chelsea are hosting Newcastle at Stamford Bridge. Rob Northam is watching.
And it's Chelsea 1, Newcastle 1. Against the run of play, Newcastle have just equalised. Kieran Clark heading in a corner just before half-time. Up till then, Newcastle had offered precious little. Chelsea's goal came early on from their Spaniard Pedro, but despite a lot of possession, they have plenty to do again. Chelsea 1, Newcastle 1.
In rugby union, Newcastle Falcons are out of the European Champions Cup after losing 45-8 at Montpellier. That victory puts Montpellier top of their pool, 1 point above Edinburgh, having played a game more. Defending champions Leinster earned a 29-13 bonus point win over Toulouse. Bath narrowly beat Wasps 18-16 and Ulster beat Racing 92 at home.
The nominations for this year's Brit Music Awards have just been announced. Anne-Marie, who first made her name by singing on Clean Bandit's #1 single Rockabye, is shortlisted in 4 categories for Best Female, Best Album, Best Single and Best Video. Our entertainment correspondent Colin Patterson reports.
Leading the way with 4 nominations is Anne-Marie, including Album of the Year for her debut Speak Your Mind. Dua Lipa has double nominations in both the Best Single and Video categories, but isn't eligible for Best Female as her album was released too long ago.
I'll be riding shotgun.
Jorja Ezra is recognised in 3 categories and is clear favourite to win Best Male. While at the age of 66, there is a first Brit nomination for Nile Rodgers. Chic are up for Best International Group.
Police in Norwich are hunting for 3 men who burst into a home during a children's birthday party and threatened the occupants with knives. The raiders, who were wearing balaclavas, are said to have demanded drugs before stealing a mobile phone yesterday evening. Police believe they may have gone to the wrong address. The headlines again. Prison reform groups have welcomed government plans to abolish jail sentences of less than 6 months, but the Probation Officers Union says the strategy won't work without more resources. President Trump has dismissed a report that the FBI investigated whether he was secretly working for Russia. 2 firefighters and a tourist have been killed in a gas explosion in central Paris. Dozens of people were injured. The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has urged men in the country to unite against what he called a major crisis of rape and sexual assault. BBC News.